Why does the Premier League feel so different this year? And why are some seemingly old school tactics being brought back into play? To delve into this on today's show, brought to you by BOYLE Sports, we've got John Mackenzie and the expert brain of Mark Carey. Well, Mark, talking about the Premier League feeling so different this season, can you tell us some of the differences you've noticed, especially in the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I always have my sample size alarm at the ready because we are only 6 games into the season. But I do think it's interesting of some of the trends that are starting to emerge already. And one of them is set pieces. It has been something that a lot of people have spoken about anecdotally, but it is backed up by the numbers. And not just in terms of its raw form, but also the share of set piece goals that have been scored as a share, a percentage of the total. And as much as anything, you can see that there's been a consistent either side of 30% share of goals scored via set pieces. This is including penalties, but we want to keep it broader to dead ball situations, shall we say. But looking at that increase here to 36% so far this season, it really shows just the notable increase. And I think that a lot of people will rightly say that we are only 6 games into the season. And the reason that you've seen more of a steady trend line across previous seasons is because you've got a whole 380 games to compare it to. So for that reason, I've already thought one step ahead, and I'm comparing apples with apples, shall we say, to the respective opening 6 games of the previous seasons as well. And you can still see a higher share of goals scored via set pieces. So last season, you got 25% of goals. Comparing that to this season, you're talking 1 in 3 goals are scored via set pieces. So everything that everyone is sort of talking about, there's a lot of memorable goals scored from corners late on. It's not just that we are sort of skewed towards those that we remember the most. There seems to be a trend that's emerging.
Okay, is this coincidence or is there actually some intention to it?
I think there's lots of things that we can talk about to explain why this might be happening. But for me, the biggest one is probably the rise of physicality in the Premier League. So I think in the past, statisticians have always said we should look at set pieces because they are a really good way of finding marginal gains, or even maximal gains, I guess, when it comes to finding ways of routes to goal. Yeah. In general, though, you get this statistical problem of survivorship bias, where essentially the data skews towards the teams who are good at a thing. So you can point to the teams who are scoring a lot of goals from set pieces and say you should be scoring more set pieces because the teams who are good at it are doing it. A lot of teams don't have the kind of players to be able to do that. But I think because we're moving towards this more physical version of the Premier League, what that means is that a lot of clubs now have the players to be able to optimise from set pieces. So I think a big part of this jump up is just that the natural consequence of the way that the Premier League is moving from a tactical point of view, just playing into the hands of this set piece dominance.
And they have the players, but they also have the staff members as well. Yeah. It's not a coincidence that we've seen an increase in set piece specialists, set piece coaches, which I know that clubs did always work on set pieces, and have done through the history of football. But now that we are getting more creative, choreographed routines from the brain of these set piece coaches, it seems like that is also, it would be surprising if it weren't the case that we're going to see a difference in the trend. And there might be a bit of a latency from when those specialists have come into the clubs from a couple of seasons. Maybe now this is the season where we're really starting to see it pull away.
We should talk about the promoted sides as well.
Sam talked about it in last week's show, right?
Take a team like Leeds United, where over the last couple of seasons they've been really focusing on looking at the information behind survival in the Premier League and finding these trends of things that the teams who do survive, what they're really good at. And one of those things is set pieces. And again, that goes hand in hand with the fact that they found that actually physicality, being able to control games out of possession, are also very important. And these things all play in together. The ability to be able to play physically out of possession also probably lends you to being pretty good at set pieces.
We have to talk about throw-ins. Bring back Rory Delap, I say. I mean, come on, man. Talk to me about that, because that is very obviously something I've noticed this season.
Yeah, I think long throw-ins have been the poster boy for what we're referring to here in set pieces. So they are included within the umbrella of set pieces. And I do think it's interesting to show the trend here as well of just how much it has been the case. So every team has taken what we're referring to a long box throw here. And this is a throw that's taken within the final third and essentially lands or ends in the penalty area. Every team has done that at some point this season, which is quite rare at the early stage of the season. And only 3 teams haven't generated a shot from this sort of situation. That's Manchester City, Aston Villa and Nottingham Forest. So it's not just that they're doing it to maybe even just gain territory. It's a very conscious, again, choreographed routine to try and generate chances. So Looking at this graph again, in terms of the share of those final third throws, all of them that are in the final third, how many were actually directed into the penalty area? This is comparing apples with apples with the respective opening 6 games of the season, of previous seasons. And it's hovering, again, either side of 11% quite consistently. A huge increase, a huge spike to 26%. So over 1 in 4 throws across the whole of the Premier League this season in the final third are being directed into the penalty area, which, again, we've seen it firsthand that it's not just a throw to someone's feet. It is get all the centre-backs forward, treat it as though it is a wide free kick or a corner, and try and get a bit of a set-piece routine going. And I think it's worth actually looking at what the teams are doing here in terms of trying to generate chances. And this is looking at the league level. It's unsurprising because not everyone is Rory Delap, being able to missile it pretty much the width of the whole pitch. They often can get it a bit more kind of looped to try and get first contact, just in the penalty area, shall we say. But it isn't just necessarily the fact that they're trying to get a shot from it in first contact or even second contact, although there have been some cases where it's been a flick onto the back post for someone to ghost in. Ismail Assar for Crystal Palace against Aston Villa and Fabio Carvalho for Brentford against Chelsea are 2 good examples of that. But this is why this graphic I think is interesting, because it looks at the XG, the chances generated within a 10-second window of the throw-in, which is essentially showing that you can keep that kind of move alive. You can think about wider opportunities that go beyond just lumping the ball into the box and a la Tony Pulis' Stoke, doing it just from that sort of first phase. So there's been quite a significant, as you can see from the XG on either side, chances that have been created as a consequence of these throws, and a lot of teams are doing it. It's not just a skew to certain teams, albeit there are a few teams who do it more than others. I think this is the thing that's interesting as well, that sometimes they have players who are able to launch the ball a bit further than others, but it's not even that they're trying to utilise the strengths of a certain player. When Rory Delap was doing it, it was because he could do it really well.
Do it really well, yeah.
Now it's not just that every single side has a really strong thrower, it's that they have someone who can throw it far enough, and then they can use the wider, situation and choreographed routine to then sort of think about the wider phase.
And I think as well, these graphics make it really clear that, previously we talk about set pieces and say, teams who are promoted, it's a good way of them generating chances if they can win corners. It's so hard to win corners because corners are so far away from where promoted teams are spending most of their games. Whereas you can see here, this is, just inside the opposition half, you're able to generate a set piece, which if you can make it repeatable and you have the players to make it dangerous, is a much easier way of generating a chance than having to rely on corners, which relies on you having to get the ball into certain areas to win these set pieces.
I mean, look, I don't want to talk about my team Arsenal, but come on, man. In terms of set plays, in terms of throw-ins, they are masters at it, aren't they?
Yeah, I can't believe we've got this far into the show talking about set pieces and we haven't said Arsenal. So we feel like, we should give them their due credit. I actually wrote a piece on this week.
Good plug as well. Very good.
Thank you. To try and show that, and I think it's what you just said before, John, is that maybe the teams who aren't as strong in sustaining territory in the opposition's final third, they've got to make the most of those set pieces where they can. Arsenal aren't necessarily an example of that because they do like to pin the opposition back, like to have the territory, and they can then generate chances from dead ball situations as well. So if they can't do it from open play, they've still got even just the volume of repeatable corners, sometimes wide free kicks because they've got tricky players who will get pulled down, or occasionally long throws as well, which they did. I think the first time they did it was against PSG, was it last season? It was. So it showed that it was bringing it a little bit more into the mainstream rather than it being just your Brentfords and your Bournemouths of this world. But one of the graphics that I included within this piece was essentially sort of saying something that is pretty obvious anyway, but kind of needs to be reiterated because a lot of people maybe chastise Arsenal for being over-reliant on set pieces. But it's precisely because they pin the opposition back and force those situations where they can sustain attacks that they're able to have those sorts of dead ball situations. So here we've got, and stay with me here, we've got field tilt, which is essentially territorial dominance as a metric. It's just the share of touches that two teams have in their respective attacking thirds. So if you've got a higher share, then you're more territorially dominant. And we've got shots from corners. That's self-explanatory. And putting the two together, you can just see that there's a strong positive correlation, relationship between the two. Essentially, if you have more territorial dominance, you're more likely to have more corners. If you have more corners, you're more likely to have shots from corners. If you're more likely to have shots from corners, you're more likely to have goals from corners. It's not that difficult. However, I think it's worth reiterating because, as I say, sometimes people maybe discredit Arsenal's set-piece prowess, but it's a very good way to sustain attacks and score goals, essentially.
Yeah, and I think you can add on top of that the fact that because Arsenal are pinning teams back in open play, they can generate these sort of open play set-piece scenarios where they're able to get the benefit of both sides, right? So they don't need to just take corners to be able to benefit from having strong aerial players. They can do that in open play as well. So if they're struggling to break a team down, they can throw a cross in, sort of like an open play corner, and they're just optimising for both of those things.
Yeah, well, some might say it's boring, but it's working. Anyway, let's move on because another thing I've noticed, and I'm not sure how tactical this is late goals. Szoboszlai, Gabriel very recently. I mean, how has this come into play in terms of the narrative in which we're talking?
Yeah, again, it's something which we've seen as memorable examples because they've been winning goals. At the weekend just gone, we had Eddie Nketiah scoring for Crystal Palace against Liverpool, Gabriel from a corner for Arsenal against Newcastle. And you think about the goal that Eddie Nketiah scored against Liverpool. On that day, there was 8 in total in terms of stoppage time goals. And that was actually a Premier League record in terms of a single day in terms of the stoppage time goals within Premier League history. So it's quite notable how much that it was in recent history. But I looked at it in terms of a wider trend as well in terms of stoppage time goals in recent seasons. Again, just looking at it in terms of the opening 6 games, comparing those apples with apples, other fruits are available. But there's some suggestions as to why it might have shot up after the 23-24 season, which we'll come back to. However, 20 goals in stoppage time this season so far is a notable increase. It's the highest it has been for quite some time. And John, you've got more nuanced reasons as to why that might be.
Yeah, I mean, you said before it doesn't feel like a tactical trend, but I am going to find one.
Oh, come on then. Go on, John, break it down.
And it's all to do with the way that teams are controlling games. And to explain that, we have to go historical.
Oh, really?
We have to go
on,
historical.
Socrates, please take your pew.
So let's go back to like the end of the 80s, early 90s. We've got a manager called Arrigo Sacchi. He's at AC Milan at that point in time. And what he does is he develops this approach of zonal marking, defensive system that he uses to become very successful in that. So he wins the European Cup around that time. And when I say zonal structures, what I mean is the players are focused on defending spaces. Okay. So each player will have a zone. That's their responsibility to cover, and you can cover it in different ways, but generally speaking, that's what's going to happen. By the time we get to the mid 2000s, almost all teams now are using these zonal approaches to defend. And it sets up the structure of what teams are trying to do in possession then, because if all teams are defending in a certain way, they're going to have the same kind of weaknesses. And this is why positional play becomes so popular at this time, because when we're talking about zonal structures, spaces open out between the lines, and positional play gives you really nice tools for being able to access that space, play the ball through lines of pressure, and actually generate progressive movement and attacks on goal. Now, if you're a team who's defending in this way and the team are playing through you all the time, the best thing to do to make it harder for them to do that is to reduce the amount of space that each player is covering. And generally how this happens is you drop deeper because you reduce the space between the lines, and then you basically pull everyone close together as possible. You make it compact, and you're saying you're not going to be able to play through us anymore. It's going to be harder for you to break us down. And what this does is it means that you're handing the initiative to the opponent. You're saying you can possess the ball in your build-up unit, so you can have huge amounts of possession, and you can have territorial dominance as well, because we're only going to cover as close to the goals as we need to. But it changes the way that control happens in these games, right? Because it means that the big teams, Guardiola football, it's all about when these teams start dropping off, what you can do is squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. You force them back into their own box, and you set yourself up to be able to break down low blocks. And yeah, you're leaving a lot of space for them to attack, but what you're saying is they're a long way away from the goal. We're going to structure ourselves really nicely to stop those attacks from becoming dangerous. And for the most part, we're going to have way more chances than the opponent, and for the most part, we'll end up winning these games. At some point within the last 10 years, teams start saying, we don't want this to happen anymore. We don't want to just allow the elite opponent to have the dominance and possession and everything that allows them to just dictate what's going on. So what we start seeing is a move back away from these zonal structures defensively towards more man-oriented ones, because what you're doing then is you're not thinking so much about space, you're thinking more about the individual opponent that you're marking. So what we start seeing is teams being much more aggressive in terms of getting higher up the pitch and causing problems for them in terms of ball progression. And what this does then is it makes it harder for these elite teams to control games. The problem is it's very hard for teams to do this over 90 minutes because you're having to follow opponents, you're having to track a lot of space, and yeah, you're playing against very good players. So for 90 minutes, it's tough to do this. So while these new defensive approaches are making it harder for elite teams to progress the ball, this also means that we're not seeing these elite teams just running away in games. The scorelines are much closer, but the difficulty is that it's very hard for these teams who are defending in this way to keep it up for the whole game. So as time goes on, what we see is naturally they start dropping off in games because, again, it's just easier to defend the space rather than to defend the men. And so what we're seeing then late on in games is suddenly these elite teams are being given the capacity to just progress the ball really easily. And we're back in the old style of dominance again, right? Where you start seeing these teams who are maybe drawing in games, maybe even a goal up in games, but now the elite team just can camp out in their half, break them down, they have better players, and so essentially we're ending up back in that situation. So I think the reason why, to bring it back to the question, you may have forgotten that we had a question.
Okay.
The reason why we're seeing a lot of late goals, I think, is because we're moving from this situation where teams are trying to dominate out of possession higher up the pitch to then having to drop deeper and allow the elite teams now to dominate in a territorial way that we used to see in the past. So it's just setting up the conditions for actually these late goals to happen.
John's explanation, as predicted, was very articulate, very nuanced. Could it just be that there's just the 5-substitution rule now?
That'd be much more succinct, surely.
My history lesson is very short, by way of comparison, because it was only recently that the 5-substitution rule was introduced. Although that being said, I do think it does link with what you're saying in terms of being able to sustain the intensity, especially for the favourable team, because they're also able to bring on these elite players who are able to pin back the opposition, and then they've got maybe the creativity in tight areas to be able to unlock the opposition as well. And especially when you've got 5 subs, and those 5 subs for the elite teams are Champions League winners, you've got really high quality to be able to undo a defence very quickly. But just going back to this graphic that we had before, I mentioned before that there was a spike after the 22-23 season. It was in the 22-23 season that the 5-substitution rule was introduced permanently. There wasn't an increase in that season, and often it is the case when these new rules are introduced that there's a bit of a latency. It's been the same with the short goal kick rule, or the ability to play a goal kick within the penalty area as well. There was a latency as to when that was actually benefited from, and I think it's the same here. So I wonder whether it is something as simple as that. It's probably not exactly that, but I think it would play a part that you're able to change the game more. You've got half of your outfielders able to come on, especially when, I think this is another point as well, when the games are becoming longer. It's not uncommon for a game to last 100 minutes now, very, very easily. There's more opportunity, there's more game time for these stoppage time goals to occur. So you extrapolate that across the course of a season, and 2 or 3 more minutes of stoppage time to score a goal per team times by 38 is quite a long time to be able to have the opportunity to score a goal, let alone elite sides who are able to unlock a defence if they are being pushed back over a longer period.
Yeah, I think the TLDR here is that the Premier League has become more competitive, but as time goes on in games, it still shifts in favour of the elite teams. So I think between those two things, you end up with this phenomenon occurring.
Tell you what, 2 very interesting history lessons there, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Right, one team who've also gone through changes this season are Nottingham Forest, and things don't seem to have worked out so far. Well, here's Sam Tighe to tell us why.
Welcome to What's Changed, presented by BOYLE Sports. Nottingham Forest made a big, bold move early this season, replacing Nuno with Ange Postecoglou. That represents a drastic tactical change, but will it make them better or worse? Last season under Nuno, Forest qualified for Europe using a simple but clear plan. They scored the first goal in 25 of their games, a tally only bettered by Arsenal, and after taking the lead, would drop into a deeper defensive shape. Nuno then liked to sub on an extra centre-back to see the game out, and they finished the season with the 3rd lowest average possession in the league. But Nuno is gone, and under Postecoglou, things are changing. It's a real culture shock to see Forest averaging the 4th most possession after 6 league games. Also, they scored first against Burnley and failed to protect the lead. Ange's style is much more expansive. The team now plays higher and wider up the pitch, they have more of the ball and more territory, but leave more space as a result. So far, it hasn't been effective, leaving Ange still searching for his first league win since taking the reins. If it doesn't come soon, questions will be asked.
Well, Sam talks about leaving space in behind, presumably with the idea of obviously trying to catch the opponent offside. Now, you've written about how offsides seem less common. Do you explain more of that?
Yeah, I mean, at first I thought it was just a bit of a quirk. Often when I'm flicking through the data, flicking through my spreadsheets, I try and think of anything that flags as slightly different, and it was offsides being one of them. And we can go to the board here to show that decrease. Again, comparing to the opening 6 games, we're comparing oranges with oranges this time.
All right, here we go, another fruit.
Or if it's yellow, bananas with bananas, as you can see here. Within this season, compared with the previous ones, there just seems to be a real drop, a plummet in the number of offsides compared with those previous seasons. I saw the sort of the quirk in the data, and I was just trying to think of reasons, tactical or otherwise, as to why that might be. One might be that there's the introduction of the semi-automated offside technology, which was brought in April, I think, of this year, so the end of last season, and it's sort of now in full form this season. So maybe players are more aware that you cannot get away, even with the VAR before, it was still as objective as it could be, but you really cannot get away with anything now. So maybe start your runs a yard further back so that you can ensure that you're not offside. That might be one reason, but I think there are interesting tactical reasons, which I know you've thought of, John. I think one of the things in the data as well is in terms of through balls, there's far fewer completed this season. I think it was 77 so far this season, and the past couple of seasons it's been well over 100 at this stage. So I think that there's something more at play that's not just kind of looking at the last line and offside there, but the way that teams are kind of progressing through the field, I suppose.
Yeah, and I am going to go back into
it.
Well, yeah, you'll remember I said what we're seeing now is teams being way more aggressive out of possession when teams are in build-up, where previously they sat off and the space was for the team in possession was around their build-up line. That space is now being removed. They're not being allowed that space to dominate the ball. But that has a knock-on effect because the space which is opening out that can be accessed is between these two lines of the midfield and the defence. So I'll just draw them on here. So what we're seeing then is this space being opened out and teams now trying to access it through maybe faster play, more direct play. Yes, you can, if you want, try and go long over the top here, but the teams are just so good at defending these kind of situations. There's not much point in doing that. So a lot of long play now is designed to win second balls in this area as well. So I think this is really interesting because what we're starting to see now is a change in the way that offside line is being perceived. It's not being perceived when you build up in a patient way and you're forcing the opponent back. That offside line becomes basically the last frontier that you have to get past. If you can get in behind that, you're going to have a lot of joy. But what we're starting to see now is that if you can win the ball in this kind of area, you don't need to worry so much about the offside line because you're going to force it back naturally. You're going to be running at speed in a more transitional moment, and you don't need to use through balls, for example. So I think this is really interesting. So I've got an example of this happening from a recent game. The game happened to be the Newcastle-Liverpool game. Now, Newcastle are down to 10 men at this point, so I think it does exacerbate how open they look at in this situation. But I just wanted to talk you through it. So we've got Liverpool building up on the right here and they're going to the left. And we can already see that Newcastle are doing what I was talking about. They're denying the players in the early phases of build-up for Liverpool any kind of time on the ball. They're going to jump up. And the way that Liverpool are going to try and use that then is to try and open out this space between the back line of Newcastle and their midfield, get the ball into that area and then have these transitional moments within those areas. So we've got a good example here of Gravenberch dropping out, pulling his player with him. And again, what that is doing is evacuating that space between the two lines. And you can already see there's a huge amount of space that's opened out here. So I've just drawn these two lines on. So I've called this the midfield line. There is a defensive midfield in behind that. But as you can see, Liverpool already looking like they're going to be able to access that area quite dangerously. Gravenberch plays the bounce pass into Konate, and then Konate can just play the ball down the line. And we can see here, I think this is McAllister, he's able to make the run into the space that opens out. And then this is what I'm talking about. These are the examples that we're starting to see now. Teams are trying to access these areas through build-up in a very direct way rather than slowly force the opponent back. It's a very different kind of situation. And then we look at that back line. This is not a team that's trying to play an offside trap. This is a team that is attempting to then prevent any space from opening out. So they're dropping back. And so you can see Liverpool can just carry the ball all the way forward to the edge of the box before that line stops. There's not really any space to play offsides there. The tactical landscape has changed. The way that teams are trying to exploit space has changed, and I think that is why we're seeing fewer of these examples of offsides.
I think there are exceptions to the rule this season as well. I think Manchester City have been quite aggressive in their tendency to jump up, and I think that it's been spoken about widely tactically that it's always fine until it's not, because they have been caught out a few times and it's been really, really marginal. The other poster boys for this across Europe are Barcelona, and since the start of last season they've caught teams offside 213 times. The notable thing that in La Liga, the next highest is 130, which is Valencia. So far and away the most aggressive in their offside line. It's a staple of what Hansi Flick likes to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you've mentioned that, because I think this does reveal something about the way that teams are trying to play out of possession, because teams like Barcelona and Manchester City, they want to control teams high up the pitch as well, right? And I think we saw City last season, they were struggling to control teams and they were getting caught on counters all the time. This season it feels like City have almost like leaned into that and gone super aggressive. We saw the game against Brighton where they were just pressing so high up the pitch to try and stop the opponent from having any sort of possession dominance. And as you say, one of the ways of doing that is like playing your line high as well, because it compacts the space that you have to cover, but it can mean that you get caught out. Barcelona, a really interesting example of that as well. And I think what shows up really nicely, if you look at some of the ways that they are being scored against this season, is that they are trying to reduce the space that we're talking about that opens up between the midfield and the defensive line, but it raises other questions, right? Because it brings offside back into the game again. So this is from the recent game against PSG. PSG get a late winner, and PSG get a late winner by manipulating Barca's back line and a high offside line where they're trying to play a trap. So I've just got the sequence of play here, because what we've got here is PSG trying to do what we're talking about, bait the opponent up, open out those spaces, and Barca refuse to allow it to happen. So centre-back has the ball, plays it into the feet of one of the forwards dropping in, and the forward dropping in then dribbles backwards, tries to bring opponents with him. So I've got the pressing line for Barcelona here. This is exactly what we're talking about. Try and open out that space between here and the back line and then exploit it. But Barcelona don't want to do that. Look how high their defensive line is. You can see them pushing right up. And in the end, when the ball gets played back out to a PSG player, we can see there's no space whatsoever between the back line and the pressing line here as well, with the midfielders in the middle. Now, to do that, they've had to just push their line super high. In the clip where we had Newcastle and Liverpool, Newcastle immediately just ceded the territory, and they were like, we're going to get back. We're not going to allow this to become a problem. Barcelona are doing the opposite thing. They're stepping their line up. But the problem is that Barcelona, because they're wanting to compact this space in the middle, they end up drawn into the middle. They leave space on the outside, and a couple of things worth noticing. So the ball to the winger here, completely on. What we're starting to see teams do against Barcelona is have these, we call them passive offsides potentially, where you keep a player in an offside position, because if you are able to get through that high line in a legitimate way, eventually this player, Gonzalo Ramos in this case, is going to become in an onside position. And so you're almost getting the advantage here of being ahead of the defensive line, so that if you can get down the wing and generate a chance, then you're going to be ahead of the defenders. And that's exactly what happens here. So ball goes down the line, and you can see Hakimi is going to play it into the space. This looks offside, but because the ball is just across the line of you can see the cut of the grass, the ball is playing Gonzalo Ramos onside, and as you can see, he gets the advantage of being in that offside position. So the reason why teams aren't doing this as much is because if you do try and compact those spaces, you do leave yourself then open to the offside line, which is why Barcelona have been, yes, they catch a lot of teams offside, but the attacking team only needs to be right once, whereas the defensive team has to be right every time. So that's what we're starting to see now. Barca's back line is getting targeted by being so aggressive. It works for them for the most part, but in games in the Champions League, right? This is just a league stage game in the Champions League. What happens when this is in the knockout stages later on, and you get caught in this kind of situation? That's when it becomes a problem.
And it's not just the defensive line getting it right; it's the whole team getting it right. Because often with this sort of thing, the defensive line is really strong, but in order to squeeze the pitch that much, you need then the pressure to be on the ball. Because if any player, especially someone of the quality or anyone of the quality of PSG, gets their head up and they're able to play that ball, then you've got a really high line with no pressure on the ball. The idea is that you have the high line in order to have pressure on the ball. I know this is essentially what you said, John, but that example did not have pressure on the ball, yet still had the high line. You have one of two, that's asking for trouble. You have both, then you can squeeze the pitch and then often counter press and win the ball back. But this was just a mistake.
It requires really good players as well. So I think the interesting example of this is Liverpool played a high line under Jurgen Klopp, but you remember the season when Van Dijk got injured.
Yes.
They didn't play a high line in that season because they didn't have the centre-back to be able to manage those situations. So I can understand why a team like Barcelona would do it, because they have the personnel to be able to play in this way. The reason why no one else is doing it is because they just don't have the personnel. So that's why we're seeing offsides dropping as well.
History lessons, check. Tactical and data analysis of old school Premier League techniques, we've got you covered. Maybe Tony Pulis was right all along. We'll see you soon.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football.